June 28, 1762. The barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, St. Petersburg. The air in the pre-dawn gloom is not cold, but thick, heavy with the humid stench of the Neva marshes, the sour smell of unwashed wool uniforms and something else, a sharp, ozonic tang of pure, distilled fear. This is not the sound of an army preparing for battle. There are no trumpets, no shouted commands. There is only a muffled, inhuman hum, the sound of thousands of men trying to hold their breath at once. It's a sound punctuated by the soft, greasy clink of metal on leather as swords are adjusted, the nervous cough that escapes a throat raw with cheap vodka and anxiety, the whicker of a horse, sensing the tension in its rider's hand. In the center of this coiled spring of men stands a figure that is a paradox in itself. A woman, 33 years old, dressed in the dark green uniform of a male officer of the Preobrazhensky Regiment, a uniform hastily borrowed from a junior officer, its shoulders too broad, its sleeves too long. Her face, pale as bone china in the flickering torchlight, is a mask of icy composure, but her heart hammers against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every fiber of her being screams at the absurdity, the sheer, suicidal audacity of this moment. She is a German princess, with no blood right to the throne, attempting to overthrow her own husband, the crowned emperor of all the Russias. The gamble is absolute. By midday, she will either be the absolute ruler of the largest empire on earth, or her head will be on a spike on the walls of the Peter and Paul fortress. This is the moment of Genesis. This is not just a coup, it is a transfiguration, a violent act of political alchemy. The woman who entered the barracks in the dead of night was the Grand Duchess Catherine Alekseyevna, a tolerated but vulnerable foreigner. The woman who will ride out at dawn is something else entirely, a being willed into existence by sheer, unadulterated ambition. This was the baptism by which a German princess began her final, irreversible transformation into a Russian empress. This is the saga of Sophia Augusta Frederica of Anhalt-Zerbst, a woman who arrived in Russia as a piece of dynastic chattel and remade herself into one of its most potent symbols. To understand this woman, we must move beyond the simple chronicle of coups and conquests, of lovers and laws. The narrative of her life is not merely about the acquisition of power. It is a far deeper, more unsettling story about the nature of identity itself. It is the story of a complete and deliberate act of self-erasure, the methodical dismantling of one soul and the painstaking construction of another, grander and more terrible in its place. We must ask the central question, the paradox that haunted her contemporaries and continues to fascinate history. How? How did a girl from a dreary, insignificant German principality, with no legitimate claim and surrounded by enemies, not only seize the throne of the Romanovs, but come to embody the very spirit of the Russian Empire in its most expansionist and glorious age? How did she learn to speak not just the Russian language, but the unspoken language of its power, its cruelty, its vastness, and its messianic destiny? This was not a simple adaptation to a new environment. This was a conscious act of metaphysical conquest, the colonization of a Russian identity by a will of singular force. She saw that the Russian throne was not merely a chair, but a stage. And she proceeded to write, direct, and star in the most spectacular political performance of the 18th century. A performance so convincing that both she and the world eventually forgot that she had ever been anyone else. Her entire reign, from the blood-spattered dawn of her coup to the final gasping breath in her chambers, was a continuous 50,000-character answer to this single driving question. To understand the stage upon which this drama was set, we must zoom out from the misty barracks of St. Petersburg and view the world as it was in the mid-18th century. This was not a world of stable powers and clear borders. It was a seething cauldron of change, a geopolitical chessboard where old pieces were being swept from the board and new, more aggressive players were emerging. In the West, the so-called dance of the diplomats was in reality a bloody, perpetual brawl for dominance. The monumental conflict of the 7 Years' War, arguably the first true world war, was tearing the continent apart, with theaters of conflict stretching from the forests of North America to the coast of India. France and Great Britain were locked in a death struggle for colonial supremacy, a conflict that would bankrupt the French monarchy and sow the seeds of its future revolution. In the heart of Europe, a new power had been forged in the crucible of war, the Prussia of Frederick the Great. It was a state built not on commerce or ancient lineage, but on the terrifying efficiency of its army, a lean, gray wolf of a kingdom that had humbled the mighty Austrian Habsburgs and forever altered the balance of power in Germany. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, the ancient nemesis of Christian Europe, was in a state of protracted, seemingly terminal decline, the sick man of Europe, yet still possessed of immense territories and the capacity to wage devastating wars along its northern frontier. And then there was Russia. To the courts of Versailles and Vienna, it remained a semi-Asiatic enigma, a colossal, raw, and unpredictable power that had burst onto the European scene under Peter the Great, but whose true potential was still unknown. It was a nation of staggering contradictions, a European court obsessed with French philosophy grafted onto a vast medieval land of illiterate, unserved peasants. It was a military giant with feet of clay, its governance chaotic, its succession a recurring nightmare of coups and assassinations. This was the world into which the young Sophia was thrown. It was a world that did not reward humility or virtue, but ruthlessness, cunning, and an almost supernatural ability to read the shifting currents of power. It was a world perfectly suited to her talents, a world where a minor princess with nothing to lose and everything to gain could, if she were clever and brave and utterly merciless, gamble for the greatest prize of all. To comprehend the iron will that drove this transformation, we must return to the world that spawned her, a world far from the gilded halls of the Winter Palace. We must travel to the dreary, wind-swept plains of Pomerania, to the provincial court of Stettin. This was not the stuff of fairy tales. This was a world of gray skies, pinched resources, and stifling minor league ambition. Her father was a prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, a title far grander than the reality of his power, which was effectively that of a provincial Prussian governor. Her mother, Joanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, was a woman consumed by frustrated ambition, a social climber who viewed her own daughter with a chilling lack of affection, seeing her less as a child and more as a slightly disappointing pawn in her dynastic games. Sophia's childhood was a masterclass in emotional neglect. There was no warmth, no unconditional love, only the constant, unspoken pressure to be useful, to be marriageable, to be the key that might unlock a door to a more prestigious court. This environment, which would have broken a lesser spirit, became her forge. In the silent, lonely halls of Stettin Castle, she learned the essential skills for her future life. She learned to watch, to listen, to discern the hidden motives behind the polite facade of courtly life. She learned to dissemble, to hide her own thoughts and feelings behind a mask of pleasant neutrality. And most importantly, she developed a voracious, insatiable appetite for knowledge. She read everything she could get her hands on: philosophy, history, poetry, not merely for pleasure, but as a form of escape and empowerment. Books were her secret allies, her silent tutors in a world that offered her none. The ancestral curse of her family was not one of madness or treachery, but one of insignificance. She was born into a caste of people destined to be footnotes in the histories of others. It was this terror of obscurity, the gnawing fear of living and dying as a forgotten German duchess, that ignited the furnace of her ambition. She did not yet know what form her destiny would take, but she knew with a certainty that was almost terrifying in its intensity that it would not be a small one. The first step into this great game was not a triumphant procession, but a brutal ordeal, a trial by ice and distance that served as her true initiation into the world she sought to conquer. The summons came in 1744, a bolt from the blue. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia, daughter of Peter the Great, was searching for a bride for her nephew and heir, the young Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, a distant relation, was deemed a suitable candidate. German, pliable, and from a family insignificant enough to pose no political threat. The journey itself was a sensory and psychological assault. For weeks, she and her mother traveled in a bone-jarring sleigh across the frozen expanse of Eastern Europe, a landscape of terrifying monotony and sublime, intimidating vastness. They passed through a world of endless birch forests, of tiny, snow-choked villages where peasants stared at them with the dull-eyed curiosity reserved for alien beings. The cold was a physical entity, a relentless predator that seeped through layers of fur, numbing the flesh and slowing the mind. For a 15-year-old girl raised in the orderly confines of a small German town, it was like traveling to another planet. This journey was the first and most crucial part of her education. She was seeing the sheer, raw scale of the land she was entering, and she understood instinctively that such a place could not be ruled by half measures. Upon her arrival, she immediately grasped the central requirement for her survival. While her mother flitted about the court, engaging in clumsy intrigues, Sophia began a systematic and ruthless campaign to remake herself. She threw herself into studying the Russian language, practicing so relentlessly with her tutors that she contracted a near-fatal case of pneumonia, a fact that greatly endeared her to the Empress Elizabeth. She studied the rituals of the Russian Orthodox Church with a devotion that astonished the clergy. Her conversion was the pivotal moment, the point of no return. As the priests anointed her and she rose from the font, she was no longer Sophia. She was now Ekaterina Alekseyevna, Catherine. It was not merely a change of name, it was a declaration of intent, the first and most profound shedding of her German skin, a solemn vow to the alien god of this new, terrifying, and promising world. Behind the public performance of the devout convert and the diligent student lay a hidden, driving force, an inner demon born of profound and constant humiliation. This secret motivation was not the grand, abstract ambition for power one reads about in history books. It was a raw, visceral, and deeply personal fear of failure and erasure. The source of this humiliation was her husband, the Grand Duke Peter. He was not a monster of cruelty, but something almost worse, a pathetic, infantile man-child. While Catherine was devouring books on philosophy and history, Peter was playing with toy soldiers, arranging them in elaborate battle formations in his chambers and holding court-martials for rats he caught in the palace. He was a violent alcoholic, cruel in a petty, unpredictable way, and he made no secret of his contempt for his clever, ambitious wife and for Russia itself. He openly yearned for his native Holstein, praised Russia's arch-enemy Frederick the Great, and derided the Orthodox faith that Catherine had so publicly embraced. For Catherine, a woman of formidable intellect and iron self-control, being shackled to such a man was a form of exquisite torture. Worse still was the constant existential threat of her position. For years, the marriage remained unconsummated, a fact that was an open secret at court. In a dynastic system where a woman's primary value lay in her ability to produce an heir, her barrenness was a death sentence. She lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, knowing that at any moment, the Empress Elizabeth could simply discard her, annul the marriage, and send her back in disgrace to the gray obscurity of Stettin. This terror, the specter of that dreary castle looming in her mind, became the fuel for her ambition. She understood that she could not rely on her husband or the whims of the Empress. Her only security lay in making herself indispensable, in weaving herself so deeply into the fabric of Russian life that she could not be cut out. This was the true genesis of her transformation. It was a survival strategy. She had to become more Russian than the Russians, more orthodox than the patriarch, more committed to the glory of the empire than the Romanovs themselves. She was not just trying to win a crown. She was fighting for her very existence. In this perilous environment, a single, powerful patron could mean the difference between survival and ruin. But Catherine's strategy was far more subtle and far-reaching. She did not forge one fateful alliance. She recognized that the true power in Russia did not reside in any single individual, not even the Empress. Instead, she identified the collective character of the Russian court and the ruling class as her true target, the entity she had to seduce and conquer. This was a world of shifting factions, of ancient noble families and upstarts raised to power by imperial favor, of grim-faced priests and flamboyant military commanders. It was a venomous snake pit of intrigue, where fortunes were made and lives were ruined by a whispered word or a perceived slight. Catherine, the isolated German girl, navigated this treacherous landscape with a preternatural skill. She cultivated the friendship of the powerful Orloff brothers, 5 swaggering, ambitious military officers who commanded the loyalty of the elite guards regiments. She charmed the cunning diplomat Nikita Panin, who saw in her the potential for a more rational and predictable form of government. She engaged in a long and flattering correspondence with the influential intellectual and courtier Ivan Shuvalov. But her most important conquest was that of public opinion within the St. Petersburg elite. She mastered the art of the subtle gesture. She displayed a fervent, almost theatrical piety that impressed the powerful clergy, who were disgusted by her husband's open Lutheranism. She showed a keen interest in military affairs, flattering the marshals and generals who were alienated by Peter's obsessive admiration for the Prussian army. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to offer sympathy, to remember names and family connections, to become a repository of the court's grievances and aspirations. In essence, she turned her very powerlessness into a weapon. As the wife of the heir, she had no official authority, which meant she was not a threat. She could be a confidant, a sympathetic ear, a silent alternative to the increasingly erratic and unpopular Grand Duke. Her primary alliance was not with a person, but with an idea. The idea of a Russia that was being betrayed by its own future emperor. She quietly and methodically positioned herself as the guardian of the nation's honor, the champion of its faith, and the true heir to the legacy of Peter the Great. She was forging a silent conspiracy of hearts and minds, long before the first conspiratorial whisper was ever uttered. The price of ultimate power is almost always paid in blood, and the foundation of Catherine's long and celebrated reign was built upon the dark and morally ambiguous ground of regicide. When Empress Elizabeth finally died in January of 1762, Catherine's husband ascended the throne as Emperor Peter III. The 6 months that followed were a masterclass in political self-destruction. In a matter of weeks, Peter managed to alienate every single powerful faction in the empire. He immediately pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War, abandoning its Austrian allies and handing a stunning victory to his idol, Frederick the Great of Prussia, an act seen by the army as a profound national humiliation. He planned to lead the Russian army in a pointless war against Denmark to reclaim his ancestral lands in Holstein, a prospect that horrified the Guards' regiments, who had no desire to die for a patch of German mud. He openly mocked the Orthodox clergy, confiscated church lands, and made plans to reform the church along stark Lutheran lines. He surrounded himself with his German cronies from Holstein, treating the proud Russian nobility with open contempt. As Peter's popularity plummeted, Catherine's rose in inverse proportion. She remained a silent, dignified, and conspicuously pious figure, a living reproach to her husband's chaotic and un-Russian behavior. The conspiracy that had been simmering beneath the surface now coalesced with terrifying speed around her. The Orloff brothers, led by the charismatic and reckless Grigory, her lover, became the enforcers. On the night of June 28th, with Peter away at his palace of Oranienbaum, the plotters struck. Catherine was whisked from the Peterhof Palace to the barracks of the Izmailovsky Regiment, where she was proclaimed the autocratic ruler. The other regiments quickly followed suit. It was an almost bloodless coup. Peter, upon hearing the news, collapsed into indecision and despair and surrendered without a fight. He was taken to a country estate at Ropsha, under the guard of Alexei Orlov. A week later, he was dead. The official cause was a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic, an explanation so absurd it convinced no one. The truth, revealed in a panicked and liquor-stained letter from Alexei Orlov to the Empress, was that he had been murdered in a drunken brawl. Catherine had her throne, but it was forever tainted by the shadow of her husband's convenient death. She was the beneficiary of a murder she likely did not order, but which she did nothing to prevent and everything to cover up. This original sin would shape her entire reign, forcing her to constantly legitimize her rule through glory, conquest, and the projection of an image of enlightened strength. Every great ruler is defined by their great adversary, and for Catherine, the ultimate antagonist was not a person, but a rival empire, a centuries-old geopolitical foe. The Ottoman Empire, sprawling across the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the Middle East, was the great southern barrier to Russia's ambitions. To the statesmen of St. Petersburg, the Ottoman presence on the northern shore of the Black Sea was an intolerable strategic threat and a historical injustice. This was the land of the ancient Greek colonies, the cradle of Russian orthodoxy, and for generations, Russian rulers had dreamed of expelling the crescent and raising the cross over the turquoise waters of the Bosphorus. This grand, almost mystical vision was known as the Greek project, the dream of resurrecting a new Byzantine empire with its capital in Constantinople, or Tsargrad, as the Russians called it, ruled by a Russian prince, likely Catherine's own grandson, who was pointedly named Constantine. This was more than mere territorial expansion. It was a messianic quest, a belief in Russia's destiny to be the protector of all Orthodox Christians and the heir to the Eastern Roman Empire. The conflict was also driven by stark economic and strategic realities. Russia was a continental behemoth, but it was landlocked. Its access to the sea in the north was frozen for half the year. The Black Sea was the key to unlocking Russia's vast agricultural wealth and projecting its power into the Mediterranean. To do this, Russia needed to control the entire northern coastline and, crucially, gain free passage through the Turkish-controlled straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. This obsession with securing a warm water port became the central, driving impulse of Catherine's foreign policy. Her two wars against the Ottoman Empire, from 1768 to 1774, and from 1787 to 1792, were brutal, large-scale conflicts that defined her reign. They were fought in the vast, sun-scorched steppes of Ukraine and the Caucasus, and they pitted the disciplined, emerging power of the Russian army against the still formidable, if decaying, might of the Janissaries. This epic struggle against the Ottomans was the primary forge of Russia's imperial identity under Catherine, the grand stage upon which she would demonstrate to a skeptical Europe that her empire was no longer a semi-Asiatic backwater, but a dominant European power. Even for a ruler who saw herself as the embodiment of reason and enlightenment, there are moments when the veneer of civilization is stripped away, revealing the primal, terrifying forces that lie beneath. For Catherine, that moment came in September of 1771, during the Great Plague Riot in Moscow. A devastating outbreak of bubonic plague had swept through the city, killing tens of thousands and turning the ancient capital into a charnel house. The city's governor, Pyotr Saltykov, had fled in panic, and the administration had completely collapsed. In this vacuum of authority, fear and superstition took over. A massive, desperate crowd gathered at the Varvarsky gates of the Kitai Gorod, drawn by rumors that a religious icon there had the power to heal the sick. The Archbishop of Moscow, Ambrosius, a man of the Enlightenment, recognized that this dense gathering of people was a public health catastrophe that would only spread the plague further. He gave the order to have the icon removed for the public's own safety. The reaction was instantaneous and savage. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy by religious hysteria and convinced that the authorities were in league with the German doctors they believed were poisoning the wells, turned into a vengeful mob. They stormed the Chudov monastery inside the Kremlin, found the terrified archbishop, and dragged him out. They beat him, tortured him, and finally lynched him, tearing his body to pieces. For days, the city was in the hands of the rioters, who hunted down doctors, officials, and the wealthy in a paroxysm of bloody violence. For Catherine, receiving these reports in the elegant, rational calm of St. Petersburg, this was a profound psychological shock. This was not a political rebellion. It was an explosion of medieval darkness, a glimpse into the terrifying abyss of the popular soul. She, the correspondent of Voltaire, the lawgiver, ruled over a people who would tear a man apart over a piece of painted wood. It was a brutal lesson. It taught her that the Enlightenment she championed was a fragile, imported flower that had not yet taken root in the deep, dark soil of Russia. It hardened her resolve, convincing her that progress could not be achieved through gentle persuasion. It had to be imposed from above, with an unyielding and, if necessary, brutal hand. The mob in Moscow taught her the limits of philosophy and the necessity of autocracy. If the Moscow plague riot was a terrifying glimpse into the abyss, the Pugachev rebellion was a full-scale plunge into it, an event that shook the very foundations of Catherine's empire and permanently altered her psychology as a ruler. The rebellion erupted in 1773, led by an obscure Don Cossack named Emilian Pugachev. He possessed a charismatic audacity and a stroke of malevolent genius. He declared himself to be the miraculously saved Emperor Peter III, Catherine's murdered husband. This was not just a clever trick. It was a masterstroke of political theater that tapped into a deep well of peasant messianism and hatred for the ruling class. To the millions of serfs, Cossacks, and ethnic minorities of the Volga and Ural regions, Pugachev was not an impostor. He was a deliverer, a red sun Tsar come to free them from the bondage of the landlords and the foreign German Empress in St. Petersburg. The rebellion spread like a wildfire across a vast territory, becoming a full-scale peasant war of unimaginable brutality. Landowners were hunted down and slaughtered, their wives and daughters violated, their manor houses burned to the ground. Pugachev's forces captured major cities like Kazan, which they sacked and burned in a week-long orgy of violence. The war took on the character of a race war and a class war, a settling of centuries of scores. For Catherine, this was her ultimate nightmare come to life. The specter of her dead husband had literally risen from the grave to lead an army of the dispossessed against her. The chaos and savagery of the uprising confirmed her worst fears about the Russian people. The fears first sparked by the plague riot. She saw it as the ultimate triumph of Asiatic barbarism over her project of European order. Yet, in this moment of supreme crisis, she demonstrated her characteristic iron will. She appointed brilliant generals like Alexander Bibikov and Peter Panin, who slowly and methodically crushed the rebel armies. Pugachev was eventually betrayed by his own followers, captured, and brought to Moscow in an iron cage. His execution in January 1775 was a carefully staged piece of imperial theater. But Catherine understood that military victory was not enough. The rebellion had exposed the terrifying weakness of the state's control over its own territory. In its aftermath, she did not retreat, but advanced. She used the catastrophe as the ultimate justification for radical centralization. She pushed through the statute for the administration of the provinces of the All-Russian Empire in 1775, a sweeping reform that dismantled the old, chaotic provincial structures and replaced them with a rational, uniform system of governance, cementing the absolute power of the central state over every corner of her vast realm. The fire of the rebellion was used to temper the steel of Russian autocracy. Amidst the endless wars and internal rebellions, there was one moment that represented the undisputed climax of Catherine's reign, the culmination of 2 centuries of Russian geopolitical striving. This was the annexation of the Crimean Khanate in 1783. The Crimea, a sun-drenched peninsula jutting into the Black Sea, was more than just a piece of territory. It was a place of immense symbolic and strategic importance. For centuries, it had been the heartland of the Crimean Tatars, vassals of the Ottoman Sultan, who had launched devastating slave raids into Russia and Ukraine. The Crimean yoke was a scar on the Russian national psyche. Strategically, the peninsula was a natural aircraft carrier, the key to dominating the entire Black Sea. Catherine's first war with Turkey had already weakened the Ottomans' grip, forcing them to recognize Crimea as an independent state, which was in reality a Russian protectorate. But this was an unstable solution. Her favorite and most brilliant partner, Grigory Potemkin, the true architect of her southern policy, knew that only outright annexation would secure Russia's interests. Through a masterful combination of diplomacy, bribery, and military intimidation, Potemkin engineered the voluntary submission of the last Crimean Khan to Russian rule. In April 1783, Catherine issued a formal manifesto declaring the Crimea, along with the Taman Peninsula and the Kuban region, to be part of the Russian Empire forever. To celebrate this monumental achievement, Potemkin orchestrated one of the most spectacular public relations events in history. Catherine's journey to her new southern provinces in 1787. It was a procession of unprecedented scale and luxury, designed to awe both her own subjects and the assembled diplomats of Europe. As her flotilla sailed down the Dnieper River, she was greeted by cheering crowds in newly constructed, freshly painted villages that sprang up as if by magic along the riverbanks. The origin of the famous and likely exaggerated myth of the Potemkin villages. The climax of the journey was in the newly founded naval base of Sevastopol, where Catherine, accompanied by the visiting Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, reviewed a powerful new Black Sea fleet that had been built in just a few years. It was a stunning demonstration of Russia's newfound power, a theatrical masterpiece that announced to the world that Russia was no longer just a Baltic power, but a Black Sea and Mediterranean one as well. For Catherine, this was the moment of her greatest triumph, the fulfillment of the dreams of Peter the Great, a victory that washed away the stain of her dubious accession to the throne and cemented her legacy as one of the great empire builders in Russian history. At the zenith of her power, during the triumphant tour of the newly acquired Crimea, the transformation was complete. The German princess from Stettin was a distant, almost unimaginable memory. In her place stood Catherine the Great, the Semiramis of the North, a figure who had come to fully inhabit the magnificent myth she had so carefully constructed around herself. This was the moment of her supreme hubris, a sense of self-satisfaction that was, in her mind, entirely justified. She did not see herself as a vulgar conqueror, a land-grabbing tyrant. She viewed her actions through the lofty prism of the Enlightenment philosophy she so admired. She was the philosopher on the throne, the friend and correspondent of Voltaire and Diderot, and she saw her expansion of the empire not as an act of aggression, but as an act of civilization. She was bringing order, law, and progress to the wild, anarchic steppes. She was suppressing the barbarism of the Tatars and the Ottomans and replacing it with the rational, well-ordered administration of an enlightened European monarchy. Her letters from this period radiate a powerful sense of historical destiny. She truly believed that she was an instrument of providence, chosen to complete the work of Peter the Great and lead Russia to its rightful place as a dominant power in the world. When she looked at the new cities like Kherson and Sevastopol rising from the empty plains, she saw not the brutal displacement of the native populations, but the triumph of reason over chaos. When she reviewed her new Black Sea fleet, she saw not a tool of war, but a guarantor of peace and a protector of commerce. This self-perception was a crucial element of her political genius. She understood the power of narrative, and she wrote her own, casting herself as the heroine of an epic tale of progress. She successfully sold this image to the intellectual elites of Europe, who for the most part eagerly accepted it. They saw in her the living embodiment of their dream, a monarch who ruled with absolute power but was guided by reason and philosophy. This moment of hubris was not just about personal vanity. It was a profound belief in the righteousness of her own historical mission, a conviction that her ambition and the destiny of Russia were one and the same. In the grand drama of Catherine's reign, the macro-level antagonist was the sprawling Ottoman Empire, but her most intimate and psychologically significant enemy was a single man, Emelian Pugachev. He was more than a rebel leader. He was her dark doppelganger, the monstrous antithesis of everything she claimed to represent. Their conflict was not just a military struggle, it was a profound ideological and personal battle for the soul of Russia. Pugachev, the illiterate, charismatic Cossack, embodied the Russia that Catherine both feared and secretly knew she could never fully tame. The Russia of chaotic, violent peasant rage, of mystical belief in a true Tsar, of a deep-seated hatred for all forms of imposed, westernized order. When he claimed to be her murdered husband, Peter III, he unleashed a psychological weapon of immense power. He became the ghost at her feast, a living embodiment of the original sin upon which her reign was founded. He represented the legitimacy she lacked, the blood right of the true Romanov, even though he was an impostor. This gave their struggle a deeply personal chemistry. For Pugachev and his followers, Catherine was the ultimate villain, a German woman, a usurper, a whore on the throne of Holy Russia who had killed her Russian husband and now ruled in favor of the parasitic French-speaking nobility. For Catherine, Pugachev was the ultimate horror, not just a threat to her throne, but a threat to her entire civilizing project. He was the face of the Cherny Narod, the dark people, whose savage uprising threatened to undo a century of westernization and plunge Russia back into the medieval barbarism she believed Peter the Great had begun to banish. The sheer brutality of his rebellion, the wholesale slaughter of nobles and officials, confirmed her deepest prejudices and fears. The duel between them was therefore a duel between two competing visions of Russia. Catherine's was a vision of a rational, centralized European empire, a nation of laws and order imposed from above. Pugachev's was a vision of a mythical Cossack freedom, a peasant utopia without landlords, taxes, or officials. The fact that she had him brought to Moscow in an iron cage and subjected to a public execution was not just about punishment. It was a necessary ritual, an exorcism of the demon that had challenged her right to define Russia's identity. The defeat of Pugachev was a military victory, but the memory of his rebellion never left her. It was a permanent, chilling reminder of the volcanic passions that slept uneasily beneath the polished surface of her empire. While the thunder of cannons on the southern frontiers and the screams of rebellion on the Volga defined the dramatic peaks of her reign, Catherine also understood that true state-building happens in the quieter, less glamorous work of administration and reform. This was the mid-level of her activity, the systematic effort to strengthen the machinery of the state. Her most ambitious project in this vein was the nakaz, or instruction, which she drafted in 1767 for a grand legislative commission she had summoned. This was a remarkable document, a sprawling compilation of Enlightenment ideals drawn directly from the works of Montesquieu and Beccaria. It spoke of equality before the law, the abolition of torture, and the principles of rational governance. The commission itself was an unprecedented event, bringing together delegates from every social class, except the serfs, and region of the empire to codify a new set of laws. However, the project ultimately became a grand failure. The delegates descended into squabbling over their own narrow class interests, and the commission was eventually disbanded without producing a new legal code. The nakaz remained a statement of philosophical intent rather than a practical blueprint for reform. Yet, it was a masterful piece of public relations that cemented her reputation in Europe as a philosopher queen. More concrete and lasting were her administrative reforms, particularly after the Pugachev rebellion. The 1775 Statute for the Administration of the Provinces was a monumental piece of legislation that completely rationalized the internal governance of the empire, dividing it into uniform provinces and districts, each with a clear and standardized set of administrative and judicial institutions. This reform, while less famous than the nakaz, was far more consequential, creating the bureaucratic framework that would hold the vast empire together for the next century. Beyond law and administration, she was a prodigious builder and patron. She founded schools, including the famous Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded institution of higher education for women in Europe. Her passion for art collecting led to the founding of the Hermitage Museum, which began as her personal collection. She sponsored scientific expeditions, academies, and the arts, consciously fostering a sense of cultural greatness to match Russia's military might. Yet, this entire edifice of enlightened construction was built upon the dark and unchanging foundation of serfdom. In fact, her reign saw the legal status of serfs worsen, and she gifted hundreds of thousands of state peasants to her favorites, turning them into private property. This was the central contradiction of her rule. She built the gleaming European facade of an enlightened state, but did nothing to change the fundamental structure of the unfree society that supported it. To paint a full portrait of Catherine, we must weave in the onions and vegetables, the more personal and contextual details that give the meat of her political actions its distinctive flavor. One of the most famous and often misunderstood aspects of her life was her succession of lovers, or favorites. In the patriarchal world of the 18th century, a powerful woman's sexuality was often used as a weapon against her, and a mythology of nymphomania grew up around Catherine. The reality was more complex and political. Her favorites were not simply romantic partners, they were a central part of her system of governance. After the trauma of her marriage to Peter, she never remarried, understanding that a royal consort would demand a share of power that she was unwilling to give. Instead, she chose her lovers herself, elevating them to positions of immense wealth and influence, but always making it clear that their status was entirely dependent on her will. They served as her confidants, her advisors, and her most trusted agents. The most significant of these, by far, was Grigory Potemkin. Their relationship was a tempestuous, passionate, and deeply intellectual partnership that lasted for decades, even after their romantic affair had ended. Potemkin was a man of colossal energy and vision, a brilliant military commander and administrator who was the co-architect of her entire southern policy. He was the only man she treated as a near equal, her colleague, her student, and her master. Another crucial context is her fraught relationship with her son and heir, the Grand Duke Paul. Paul was the living embodiment of her past sins. He grew up worshiping the memory of the father she had overthrown and loathing the mother who held the power that he believed was rightfully his. Their relationship was a cold war of mutual suspicion and resentment. Catherine saw in Paul the same instability and pro-Prussian obsession that had doomed his father, and she did everything she could to exclude him from state affairs, at one point even contemplating a plan to bypass him in the succession in favor of her grandson, Alexander. This private familial drama had profound public consequences, creating a constant source of instability at the heart of the court. Finally, there was her life as a writer and intellectual. Catherine was a prodigious author, penning plays, articles, and a voluminous correspondence. Her letters, especially to European luminaries like Voltaire, Grimm, and Diderot, were a masterclass in 18th century public relations. Through them, she crafted and controlled her own image, presenting herself to the world as a wise, humane, and progressive ruler, often masking the brutal realities of her autocracy behind a shimmering veil of enlightened rhetoric. For nearly 3 decades, Catherine's reign seemed to be a story of ever-expanding power and triumph, a steady ascent into the pantheon of great European monarchs. But in the final decade of her life, The first cracks began to appear in the magnificent edifice she had constructed. The first and most profound shockwave came not from the battlefields of the Ottoman Empire or the steppes of Russia, but from the streets of Paris. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, was an event that struck terror into the heart of every crowned head in Europe. For Catherine, it was more than just a political crisis. It was a deep, personal betrayal. These were the very ideas of the Enlightenment that she had championed, the philosophies of her friends and correspondents, now twisted into a monstrous, regicidal force. The execution of King Louis XVI in 1793 was the final, horrifying confirmation of her fears. The world she had understood, the world of enlightened monarchs and rational reform, was coming to a violent end, replaced by the terrifying new doctrine of popular sovereignty. The news from France ignited a paranoid fear of Jacobinism within Russia itself. She began to see conspiracies and sedition everywhere. The intellectual climate of her court, once relatively open, became stifling and repressive. This external threat was compounded by internal omens. Her health was beginning to fail. The brilliant circle of advisors and commanders who had helped her win her throne and build her empire were dying off. The most devastating loss was that of Potemkin in 1791. His death left a void that could never be filled. She had lost not just a favorite, but the co-author of her imperial dream. With his passing, a certain creative energy and grand vision seemed to depart from her reign. She became more cautious, more reactionary, more focused on preservation than on bold new projects. There were also whispers of discontent within the army and the nobility, weary of constant warfare and the immense costs of her southern expansion. And always, there was the looming shadow of her son, Paul, waiting in the wings, his resentment hardening with each passing year. The glorious sunlit afternoon of her reign was drawing to a close, and the first chilly harbingers of a long, dark evening were beginning to be felt. The key decision that triggered the final, morally compromised act of her reign was not a single, dramatic choice made in a moment of crisis, but a series of cold, calculated decisions made over 2 decades. The partitions of Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once a major European power, was by the late 18th century in a state of terminal decline. Its unique political system, the Golden Liberty, with an elective monarchy and the infamous liberum veto that allowed any single nobleman to paralyze the state, had rendered it anarchic and powerless. It was a political vacuum, a sick man of its own, surrounded by 3 powerful and predatory neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Catherine's initial policy was not to destroy Poland, but to control it, to turn it into a Russian protectorate. However, the Poles' persistent attempts to reform their state and throw off Russian influence, combined with the avarice of Prussia and Austria, led to a different, more brutal solution. The psychology of her error, if it can be called that, was not one of overconfidence or desperation, but of pure, unadulterated realpolitik. She had come to view Poland with a mixture of contempt and exasperation. She saw its chaotic liberty as a dangerous infection on her borders, and its Catholic population as alien and untrustworthy. In her worldview, shaped by the principles of enlightened absolutism, a state that could not govern itself effectively had forfeited its right to exist. She justified her actions, both to herself and to the world, in the language of order. She was not conquering a nation. She was pacifying a failed state, putting an end to its self-destructive anarchy, and, in the case of the eastern territories she annexed, reclaiming ancient Orthodox lands and populations. This was, of course, a cynical justification for a naked act of imperial aggression. The first partition in 1772 was a pragmatic division of the spoils. The second in 1793 and the final one in 1795, which wiped Poland completely off the map, were a direct and punitive response to Polish attempts at national revival, most notably the Kosciuszko Uprising. This decision to participate in the dismemberment of a large, historic European nation was the ultimate betrayal of the Enlightenment principles she claimed to espouse. It exposed the raw, predatory nature of her statecraft and forever stained her reputation. It was the act that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the philosopher queen was, first and foremost, an empire builder, and that for the sake of the Russian state's security and expansion, any treaty could be broken and any nation could be erased. The greatest catastrophe of Catherine's reign was not a lost battle or a failed harvest. It was a slow, creeping moral and intellectual collapse in her later years. It was the tragic spectacle of the enlightened despot turning into a common tyrant, the champion of reason becoming a prisoner of fear. The catalyst for this transformation was the French Revolution. It fundamentally broke her faith in the progressive course of history and in the very Enlightenment ideals that had been the intellectual scaffolding of her entire reign. The correspondent of Voltaire, who had once written of the importance of legal due process and freedom of thought in her nakaz, now oversaw a regime of harsh censorship and political persecution. The defining case was that of Alexander Radishchev. In 1790, Radishchev, an intellectual educated in the West, published a book titled Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow. It was a searing indictment of the horrors of serfdom and the corruption of autocratic rule, written not as a revolutionary tract, but as a sentimental appeal to the conscience of the monarchy. A decade earlier, Catherine might have engaged with the book's ideas, or at least dismissed it. Now she saw it as a spark of French contagion. She personally reviewed the case, annotating Radishchev's book with furious marginalia, calling him a rebel worse than Pugachev. Radishchev was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death, a sentence Catherine commuted to a 10-year exile in Siberia. The message was brutally clear. The time for intellectual debate was over. Criticism of the system would no longer be tolerated. Another victim was the journalist and publisher Nikolai Novikov, a prominent Freemason, whose intellectual circles were seen as a hotbed of potential conspiracy. He was arrested and imprisoned without trial in the Schlüsselburg fortress. This turn towards reaction was not just a political calculation. It was the act of a disillusioned idealist. She felt that the philosophy she had loved had betrayed her, unleashing a monster upon the world. Her dream of a gradual, monarch-led evolution towards a more rational and humane society had died. It was replaced by the grim, singular task of preserving order, of holding back the revolutionary tide by any means necessary. This was the true catastrophe. The narrowing of her immense intellect, the curdling of her enlightened ambitions into a fearful, repressive defense of the status quo. The woman who had begun her reign by dazzling Europe with her progressive ideals ended it by building a police state to protect her throne from those very same ideas. The final years of the 18th century saw the gradual collapse of the Catherinian world, a slow dimming of the brilliant star that had dominated the European firmament for more than 3 decades. The Empress herself was now a force of nature in decline. She was in her late 60s, overweight and increasingly immobile, a shadow of the vibrant woman who had seized a throne in a guardsman's uniform. The grand projects that had defined the middle years of her reign were largely complete. The Ottoman Empire had been humbled, the Crimea was Russian, and Poland had ceased to exist. The task was no longer one of glorious expansion, but of grim consolidation. Her court, once a glittering center of intellectual life, was now a place of suspicion and fear, haunted by the specter of the French Revolution. The Empress, once an avid consumer of new ideas, now spent her time censoring journals and hunting for Jacobins. The political and psychological fallout of this new, reactionary turn was immense. The vibrant intellectual life she had once fostered withered under the frost of official disapproval. A generation of Russian thinkers who had been encouraged to embrace Western ideas were now silenced or exiled. But the most pressing collapse was the one happening within the walls of the palace, in the poisonous relationship between Catherine and her heir. The Grand Duke Paul, now a middle-aged man, was kept in a state of virtual house arrest at his estate of Gachina, where he drilled his private army in the Prussian style and nursed his decades-old grievances. Catherine, fearing that Paul would undo her entire life's work, seriously contemplated a last, desperate gamble: to write a testament that would disinherit Paul and pass the throne directly to her brilliant and favored grandson, Alexander. She saw in Alexander a kindred spirit, an heir to her own enlightened ideals, and she had personally overseen his education. Whether she ever formalized this plan is one of history's great mysteries. The documents were rumored to have been prepared, waiting in her desk for the right moment. This final potential coup against her own son was her last chance to secure her legacy, to ensure that the Russia she had built would survive her. But time was running out. The Empress was aging, her energy was fading, and the unresolved question of the succession hung over the court like a sword of Damocles, promising a final, chaotic reckoning upon her death. The end, when it came, was not grand or heroic. It was sudden, squalid, and profoundly human. An ironic final curtain for a life lived as a magnificent public performance. On the morning of November 16th, 1796, the 67-year-old Empress rose as usual, drank her strong coffee, and went to her water closet. There she suffered a massive stroke and collapsed onto the floor. Her attendants, alarmed by her long absence, eventually broke down the door to find their absolute sovereign lying helpless and unconscious. She was too heavy to be moved back to her bed, so they laid her on a mattress on the floor of the adjoining room, where she lingered, dying, for another 36 hours. The moment the news spread, the carefully controlled world of the court dissolved into chaos. Her latest favorite, the young and callow Platon Zubov, wandered the palace in a daze, while courtiers scurried to burn incriminating papers and switch their allegiance. The man of the hour was her son, Paul, who was summoned from his exile at Gachina. He arrived at the Winter Palace not as a grieving son, but as an avenging angel. For the day and a half that his mother lay dying, he did not wait. He immediately began issuing orders, placing his own Gachina cronies in key positions and demanding to see his mother's private papers, frantically searching for the testament that he feared would disinherit him. When Catherine finally drew her last breath on the evening of November 17th, Paul's reign began. His first acts were a petty and symbolic desecration of his mother's legacy. He ordered the body of his father, Peter III, to be exhumed from its modest grave. He then staged a grotesque joint funeral, where the coffin of the long-dead Peter was laid in state beside Catherine's, and the surviving, ancient murderers of his father were forced to stand as honor guards. It was a macabre piece of theater designed to publicly declare that his father had been a legitimate ruler and his mother a usurper. In death, the German princess who had lived and ruled as a Russian empress was posthumously tried and condemned by her own son, bringing the epic story full circle in an act of bitter Freudian revenge. The legacy of Catherine the Great is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a mirror reflecting the biases and aspirations of those who view it. There is no single, universally accepted verdict on her reign, only a series of powerful and contradictory images. For Western Europe, particularly during her lifetime and in the century that followed, she was the enlightened despot, the star of the North. She was the woman who corresponded with Voltaire, who bought Diderot's library, who wrote laws based on Montesquieu. This image, which she so masterfully cultivated, portrays her as a civilizing force, a ruler who dragged a backward, semi-Asiatic nation into the mainstream of European culture and politics. This is the Catherine of the Hermitage, the founder of schools, the patron of the arts. For the nations that were her victims, however, the picture is starkly different. For the Poles, she is Catherine the Terrible, the cynical and ruthless destroyer of their state, the architect of a national catastrophe from which they would not recover for more than a century. For the Ottoman Turks, she was the great aggressor, the infidel empress who tore away their northern territories and began the process of dismembering their empire. For the Crimean Tatars, she was the destroyer of their ancient Khanate and their way of life. Within Russia itself, her legacy is most complex and ambivalent. On one hand, she is Matushka, the Little Mother Empress, one of the most revered figures in the national pantheon. This is the Catherine of victory and glory, the ruler who expanded the empire to the south and west, who defeated the Turks, annexed the Crimea, and solidified Russia's status as a great European power. Her reign is often looked back upon as a golden age of the Russian nobility, a time of national self-confidence and cultural flowering. Yet, there is a much darker interpretation. For many Russian historians, she is the empress who, more than any other ruler, strengthened the chains of serfdom. While she spoke the language of liberty with her French correspondents, she oversaw the full legal formalization of the institution, extending it to new territories like Ukraine and gifting hundreds of thousands of free peasants into bondage. This is the Catherine whose enlightened facade concealed a brutal reality of human exploitation, the ruler who widened the already vast chasm between the westernized elite and the enslaved masses. She is at once the great modernizer and the great enslaver, a paradox that lies at the very heart of her historical identity. We are now brought back to the central paradox, the core question that has driven our entire narrative. How did the obscure German princess, Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, so completely transform herself into Catherine the Great, the quintessential Russian empress? The final, comprehensive answer is that this was not a gradual adaptation or a simple political maneuver. It was a conscious, sustained, and utterly ruthless act of will. The transformation was achieved through a threefold strategy of identity warfare. First was the complete and total cultural immersion. From the moment she arrived in Russia, she understood that her German origins were her greatest vulnerability. She attacked this weakness head-on, not by hiding it, but by annihilating it. Her obsessive study of the Russian language, her fervent and public embrace of the Orthodox faith, her deep reading of Russian history. These were not the actions of someone trying to fit in. These were the actions of an actor seeking to fully become the role, to internalize the character so deeply that the original self is forgotten. She did not just learn the lines. She sought to understand the soul of the nation she intended to rule. Second was her genius for political performance and public relations. Catherine instinctively grasped that in an autocracy, the monarch's power rests not just on force, but on mystique and legitimacy. She spent her entire life on a political stage, constantly performing the role of the ideal Russian sovereign. In her piety, she outshone the clergy. In her patriotism, she outshone the native-born nobility. In her ambitious foreign policy, she claimed the mantle of Peter the Great. Her correspondence with the European philosophes was a crucial part of this performance, a way of securing an external validation of her right to rule, an international certificate of enlightenment that she could use to legitimize her power at home. The third and most crucial element was her profound and unsentimental understanding of Russian power. She learned early on that Russian power was not based on abstract laws or ideals, but on personal loyalty, military might, and a willingness to act with decisive brutality when necessary. She understood the critical importance of the Guards' regiments, the deep conservatism of the Church, and the service-based loyalty of the nobility. She broke the world into two categories: things that strengthened the Russian state and her control over it, and things that did not. She embraced the former and ruthlessly crushed the latter. In the end, the German girl did not just put on a Russian mask. She surgically grafted it onto her face, and then onto her skull, and then onto her very soul, until no trace of the original remained. She became the ultimate immigrant success story, a foreigner who, through sheer force of intellect and will, embodied the spirit of her adopted country more profoundly than any native-born Romanov. What, then, is the universal lesson of her life, the verdict of history on this monumental figure? The saga of Catherine the Great is a profound and unsettling meditation on the nature of power, identity, and the tragic paradox of enlightened absolutism. Her life is the ultimate testament to the idea that identity, even national identity, is not merely a matter of birth or blood, but can be a construct of pure will. She demonstrated that an outsider, through study, empathy, and ruthless ambition, can come to embody the soul of a nation more completely than those born to it. She is a symbol of human potential in its most extreme form, a story of an individual from the margins of society who, through sheer force of character, rose to command the center of the world. Her story is a lesson in the intoxicating and corrupting nature of absolute power. She came to the throne with what seemed to have been genuinely progressive intentions, a desire to create a more rational, lawful, and humane society. Yet over the course of her 34-year reign, she discovered that the fundamental goal of an autocrat is not to reform the system, but to preserve it, and by extension, their own power. The noble ideals of the Enlightenment, which served as a useful justification for her seizure of the throne and the expansion of her empire, were quickly discarded when they threatened the stability of the autocratic state. Her reign thus becomes a cautionary tale, the story of how the road to a more repressive state can be paved with the language of liberty and reason. She represents the ultimate tragedy of the 18th century dream of the philosopher king. The discovery that philosophy is a fine adornment for a palace, but a dangerous tool in the streets. Ultimately, her legacy is Russia itself, the vast, powerful, and deeply contradictory empire she did so much to shape. She completed the work of Peter the Great, cementing Russia's status as a European power, but she did so by deepening the central fissure in Russian society, the gap between a westernized elite and an enslaved populace, a contradiction that would haunt Russia for the next century, and ultimately explode in the revolutionary cataclysm of 1917. The final, enduring image of her reign, the metaphor that encapsulates her entire project, is the one she herself commissioned and unveiled in the heart of her capital in 1782. It is the great equestrian statue of Peter the Great, known to the world as the Bronze Horseman. The statue itself is a masterpiece of dynamic tension. A powerful rearing horse, representing the raw, untamed nature of Russia, is controlled by the calm, commanding figure of the emperor, his arm outstretched towards the Neva River, towards the west. The horse tramples a serpent, symbolizing the forces of treason and backwardness that Peter had to overcome. But the most significant part of the monument is its inscription, carved in simple Latin and Russian on the massive granite boulder that serves as its pedestal. It does not contain a long list of titles or achievements. It says only, Petro Primo Katharina Secunda. To Peter I from Catherine II. In these few words lies the entire story. This is the final, audacious, and completely successful act of her self-creation. Here is the German usurper, with no blood connection to the Romanov dynasty, boldly and publicly declaring herself the sole, legitimate heir to the legacy of Russia's greatest modernizer. She is not merely his successor, she is his equal, the one who completed his work. The statue is not just a tribute, it is a claim, a definitive statement of her own place in history, carved in bronze and stone for all eternity. The shadow of the Bronze Horseman, stretching across Senate Square, is the shadow she cast over the empire she conquered and remade in her own image, a permanent and powerful symbol of a German princess who willed herself into the very soul of Russia.